Yo,
Yeah.
and we're back at it.
Yeah.
So
What's going on, guys?
I see that there were slavery maps, and I'm assuming these are maps or where slaves were, or primary locations, or where they were ported and exported, and you know. So I'm gonna curious to see what a slavery map looks like.
Okay.
You get what I'm saying? The maps of where the slaves were. Let's get it. Let's see what this looked like.
Interesting.
We begin at around 10,000 BC. In several places in the world, man leaves the hunter-gatherer way of life to become sedentary, developing agriculture and animal husbandry. Food becomes more abundant, the population increases, and those who are better off, notably by taking over more land, form an elite, causing increasing social inequalities. In Mesopotamia, the appearance of writing offers us the first concrete evidence of slavery. Slaves are either prisoners of war, who in some cases could be bought back by their families, or they are people in debt who enslave themselves for the time it takes to pay off their debts. Wealthy and powerful families own a few slaves, while palaces could have hundreds. The men are used for their labor force in agricultural production or in construction, while the women are often found as servants or concubines, or working in workshops such as weaving. Around 1750 BC, Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, writes a code of law that details, among other things, the treatment of slaves and the penalties they face. Slavery is also mentioned in different forms in ancient Egypt, as well as in the texts of the Old Testament, which describe the treatment reserved for slaves.
Right.
But at present, there's no archaeological evidence of the slavery of the Hebrew people in Egypt, nor of their exodus.
Hey.
In ancient Greece, the island of Chios specializes in the production of wine, which requires a large workforce. Trade ships then leave to buy non-Greek slaves who were abducted from Thrace, Scythia, and Asia Minor. In Chios, some of them end up in the vineyards. The others are sold mainly in the Aegean Sea. The city specializes in this very profitable market. Other Greek cities
In the Aegean Sea. Doesn't that sound like you said the GNC?
Mm-hmm.
Like you just go in there and it's like, yeah, you can get your slave right there next to, between the
Yeah.
BCAAs and the pre-workout.
You heard the Aegean is
GNC. It sound like
on one part,
GNC.
and then the C comes like on the
Exactly.
other side. So it's like, okay, I get it.
follow suit, and the slave population swells everywhere, so much so that around 400 BC, about half of the population of Athens is enslaved. Later on, Rome follows this model.
Half the population.
Slaves come from military conquests and from raids organized by merchants in the border regions where the so-called barbarian peoples live. The slaves are then sold in slave markets. The value of a slave varies according to the slave's sex and age, but around the 1st century AD, a slave is worth roughly about 1.5 years of salary.
Wow.
Owning one is a sign of wealth and success. The richest sometimes have thousands of slaves who are gathered in huge domains. The condition of slaves varies from place to place. Some work in mines, others are servants.
So whenever you saw like a bunch of slaves, like on a boat, person had to be very, very, very rich to have that many. Because if one slave was 1 year's worth, then that means if you think you had all these people you have taken from their home and you slaved them, think about all these people. What's the worth? How much the wealth someone to have these people?
Quite a bit.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Not on the saying of the horribleness of slavery, but just the fact of the wealth. It's either gonna be wealth or horror. That's it. That's it. It made somebody rich, or it's horror to somebody else.
Finally, the best educated could occupy more important positions, such as that of an accountant, for example. The 7th century marks the beginning of the Muslim conquests. The prisoners from the conquests are enslaved to grow the Arab armies. After the conquest of Egypt, the Muslims moved toward the Byzantines and the Berbers in the west and towards the Nubians in the south. In 652, after the failure of the siege of Dongola, a peace treaty is signed with the Nubians and both parties start to trade. The Nubians commit themselves to provide 360 healthy slaves, men and women, every year. This treaty will last almost 7 centuries. Further west, after 60 years of resistance, the North African coasts are conquered. Berbers are captured and enslaved. In reaction, many convert to Islam because it's forbidden to enslave a Muslim. In Northern Europe, the Vikings dominate the seas. During raids and pillaging, captives are made slaves and are either kept by their abductors or sold in markets.
Wow.
The best educated from the monasteries are sold at a higher price in Venice or Constantinople. In the east, Vikings, who are called Varangians, control a trade route that follows the Dnieper to Constantinople. There, they sell, among other things, Slavic slaves captured on the way. In the Abbasid Caliphate, the majority of slaves from the conquests and trade routes end up in Baghdad.
Oh, wow. Did not know that.
Further south, towards Basra, there are huge swamps. Thousands of slaves are sent there.
I'm just saying, is that why they dropped the bombs over Baghdad?
No, that's for war.
Bush, okay.
It's war.
Okay.
Work the land in order to make it arable. The work is backbreaking, and the living conditions are difficult. In 869, Ali ibn Muhammad, of uncertain origin, takes advantage of the slaves' discontent to organize an insurrection. The slaves quickly swell his army and organize a veritable guerrilla war against the large landowners and the surrounding towns and villages, which are pillaged. For 14 years, the Abbasid Caliphate is undermined and unable to regain control of the region. Finally, the revolt is defeated and put down. After the failure of mass slavery and agricultural production, domestic slavery is favored. In addition, the Caliph, to strengthen his power, creates a personal guard. Young slaves.
I just went back on something he said after the failure of mass slavery. It seemed like it wasn't no failure, so I don't.
Well, I mean, it wasn't.
Y'all have one of them tags be rubbing your neck, like,
Yes,
oh!
I know. It is the absolute worst.
Did I put a hole in my shirt?
Let me see. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
But, well, it was an epic fail because it benefited them, but it destroyed another people's mindset and livelihood, lives, period, for hundreds of years. So it was an epic fail, I feel, but no, for them, they were able to.
Not for the person making the money. It was to fail for whoever the person was, slave, because no telling who that slave, what nationality that was, but
slave.
Yeah.
From Central Asia and the Caucasus are converted to Islam and trained in combat to form a loyal army, which is called the Mamluk army. But the Abbasid Caliphate declines due to internal divisions, Christian crusades from Europe, and finally, Mongol conquests from Asia. The Mamluk army, after repelling the Seventh Crusade, assassinate the Ayyubid heir and found the Mamluk Sultanate. A few years later, in 1258, the Mongols seize Baghdad. The Abbasid heir flees to Cairo. With no more access to Asia, slaves now mainly come from sub-Saharan Africa.
Whoa.
After the conquest of North Africa, the Arabs discovered the Berber trade routes that crossed the Sahara Desert to trade with, among others, the Mali Empire, which is rich in gold and slaves. Most are captives from animist peoples further south. The slaves are sold to Tuareg caravans that take several months to cross the desert to reach Cairo.
Wow.
There, the survivors are sold in markets to become servants. The majority of slaves are women who become servants or concubines. Owning a slave raises the prestige of a family, so demand increases and the trans-Saharan slave trade grows. It's estimated that between 3.5 and 7 million slaves passed through these routes over 1,000 years.
Wow.
To the north of the Mediterranean basin, the Ottoman Empire creates an army of janissaries, that is, young European Christian slaves, who are converted to Islam and then trained for war to serve the Sultan. Finally, the Italian republics control the main trade routes of the Mediterranean basin. Genoa and Venice compete for the profitable slave trade, in particular by establishing trading posts in the Crimea, from where Slavic and Caucasian captives come.
Hey, every time it paused before he started talking, we'd be like, yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, okay, okay. History.
All the way to the west of Europe, Portugal takes advantage of the creation of the caravel, a new, more maneuverable ship, to begin explorations along the African coast in search of new trade routes. After discovering the Akan people, who own numerous gold mines, the Portuguese navigators
I want to go there.
discover an uninhabited island that they name Sao Tome. In
I love it.
1483, they reached the Kingdom of Congo, with which they start
Uh-oh.
diplomatic and commercial relations. Portugal provides European goods, such as crockery and firearms, which are exchanged for
That fire.
slaves. These are either
Yeah, for the
taken to
slaves,
the
y'all.
Iberian Peninsula or exchanged for gold in Elmina to end up in the mines or sold to Portuguese settlers in Sao Tome, where the climate allows for the cultivation of sugarcane, sugar being then a rare and expensive product highly prized in Europe. Slaves, gold, sugar, and spices coming from Asia are making Portugal very rich, and in less than a century, Lisbon becomes the richest city in Europe.
Wow.
Further east, the Ottoman Empire, which has seized Constantinople, now dominates the trade routes. In the Black Sea, the Crimean Tatars provide it with slaves from abductions. All around the Mediterranean basin, Catholics and Muslims clash via raids. Captured Muslims end up as oarsmen on Catholic galleys, while pirates from North Africa organize raids, also into the Atlantic Ocean, to seize Christians who end up in their slave markets. In 1595, in Sao Tome, the slaves, who are now in the majority, revolt. Portugal regains control, but the country is now giving more interest to the lands it controls in the Americas, where 300,000 slaves have already been sent to work in the cultivation of sugarcane.
Wow.
Triangular trade, okay.
Western European countries with access to the Atlantic Ocean gradually follow the Portuguese model and set up a globalized slave trade that takes place mainly on 3 continents. The Netherlands, England, and then France create companies to take over this new trade. Their ships are loaded with European handicrafts, such as textiles, metals, and weapons. They leave for the African coasts to exchange their goods for slaves. The latter are either prisoners of war or are the result of abductions. Hundreds of slaves are crammed into the holds of ships in appalling conditions for voyages to America that last several months. The majority end up in Brazil and the Caribbean, where the climate is ideal for growing sugarcane, but also for coffee, cotton, and tobacco. The large European landowners, called planters, exchanged the slaves for precious metals and local products. The ships then returned to Europe to sell the American products on the European markets. The companies make large profits and organize more and more shipments. Western Europe is rapidly getting richer at the expense of the labor force of Africa and the cultivatable land of America. The European states, to ensure their profits, enact new laws to control the market. In Europe, the refining of sugar and the high demand for handicrafts creates a lot of jobs, while the sudden abundance of American products on the markets brings down prices, making them accessible to a larger portion of the population. In Africa, the demand for slaves becomes so great that their value soars, leading to wars for control of the trade. Kidnappings are organized further and further inland, sometimes resulting in the taking of entire villages, which pass from hand to end up on European ships. Finally, in America, the black population swells rapidly in Brazil and the Caribbean. Those who manage to flee are called Maroons. They form communities in remote and difficult-to-access areas. For the European powers, the competition for control of the cultivatable land is increasing, which provokes wars. At the end of the 7 Years' War, France cedes its North American colonies to Great Britain and to Spain, but keeps, at all costs, most of its sugar islands. In 1781, the British ship Zong, recently captured from the Dutch, leaves the coast of Africa with 442 slaves on board, twice as many as its capacity. After 2 months of sailing, the ship reaches its destination, the island of Jamaica. But the crew confuses the island with Saint-Domingue and continues westward. 500 kilometers further on, the captain understands his mistake, but it's too late, as it would take more than 10 days to sail back, and the ship, which has not made any stopover to restock and renew its stores, no longer has enough drinking water to last that long.
What they do?
The crew decides then to throw 132 slaves, including women and children, overboard.
Yo.
Whoa.
They were like, you know what? If we cut this many and we had this much water to drink, that's crazy.
Bye-bye.
They just don't, and women and children, just bye-bye.
Okay, what else could they do?
I wonder how far
could they do?
Did any have the capability, depending on where they are, to make it, or did everybody just die?
Well,
Did anybody have the capability to swim? It's probably a ridiculously amount of distance to get somewhere, but
exactly. So maybe you didn't
you
die
just
right then, but how long you gonna be able to float out there till
you wouldn't until you just
you get
exhaustion.
ate by a shark?
No, or yeah, no, that what
killer
happened,
whale.
I'm just saying. Or yeah, you could be attacked by animals, or you just exhausted and you drown.
Yeah, because the waves be treacherous.
208 slaves arrive in Jamaica. The company that organized the expedition turns to its insurance company for compensation, but the latter refuses, and a trial begins in London. The case is followed and has an impact on public opinion, which strengthens the abolitionist movements. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade is founded, and despite its still weak influence, it obtains the first law limiting the number of slaves per ship. In France, too, the first abolitionist movements appear, notably with the foundation of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, but their impact is still weak in the face of powerful slave lobbies. Until now, approximately 7,700,000 African slaves have been deported to the Americas.
Wow.
Great Britain and France dominate this market. In the Caribbean, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where 500,000 slaves work, is now the world's leading exporter of sugar and coffee, making it the most prosperous. In 1789, the French Revolution takes place. In the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, it's written that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. In Saint-Domingue, these words resonate with the slaves and freedmen who revolt. A French civil commissioner is sent to restore order. He proclaims the emancipation of the slaves, obtaining their military support in the middle of the war against Great Britain and Spain. The following year, in Paris, slavery is officially abolished in all French colonies. But in 1802, Napoleon, who had seized power, reestablishes slavery and tries to regain control of Saint-Domingue by sending an army, but the latter is defeated.
So Napoleon did slavery like COVID and the mask. Nope. No more COVID. Nope. Put your mask back on. So how I'm sorry, take them words out. I'm gonna cut that. The C word and the mask. I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna cut that little part forward.
Okay.
January 1st, 1804, the Republic of Haiti proclaims its independence. It's the only republic to emerge from a revolt of slaves and freedmen. However, the new country will have to pay a heavy price to France, which would weaken it economically. After having transported about 2,750,000 slaves, in 1807, the United Kingdom abolishes the slave trade, but not yet slavery, which remains in force in its colonies. The country now uses its influence to put a global end to the slave trade. In 1815, after the fall of Napoleon, the European powers meet in Vienna. The United Kingdom obtains a commitment from each of them to abolish the slave trade. But in reality, it would take several decades before it really stops. Brazil resists and continues the massive importation of slaves for its coffee culture. Brazilian ships go directly to Africa to fetch slaves without passing through Europe. In 1833, the United Kingdom abolishes slavery completely. From then on, the country relies on the Industrial Revolution. The invention of the steam engine increases production in factories.
Because you got to think that's what completely made it like, all right, we don't need the slave anymore. The revolution, now we can process stuff. through machines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, let me get a piece.
And
AMSR.
and mm-mm. But it's really crystal in my ear. Okay.
Textile industry explodes, increasing the demand for cotton. In the United States, slaves living near the coast are moved all along the Mississippi River to work in cotton production. In addition, a U.S. company, after buying land in Africa, creates Liberia to organize the return of freed blacks. In
Really?
1847, Liberia gains its independence and finds itself governed by the newcomers.
I didn't know that. That's what I was questioning. Were people ever taken back? And apparently they were.
Mm-hmm.
People were taken. Some people got to go back, you know, organized from an organized level back to Liberia. Interesting.
To the detriment of the indigenous populations. In 1848, France abolishes slavery in its turn. About 250,000 slaves are freed. To prevent the planters from seceding, the state compensates for their losses by paying them and facilitating the importation of cheap labor, mainly from India and China. Finally, in the United States, after the Civil War and the victory of the Northern armies, slavery is abolished here too. But in all the former slave territories, the situation remains complicated for the freedmen. They are often confined to ghettos, controlled, and in many cases continue to be exploited without rights or income. Zanzibar is the last major slave trading port. Swahili caravans set out to raid the African Great Lakes region. The captives are then sent mainly to the plantations of Oman. In 1873, the United Kingdom obtains the end of the slave trade there, and in 1888, Brazil is the last American country to abolish slavery.
New forms of slavery.
In 1885, the European powers meet in Berlin to divide Africa among themselves and to regulate colonization, each committing itself to abolish slavery. The Belgian King Leopold II obtains as his personal possession a huge territory in the heart of the continent. To consolidate his power, he receives the services of a former powerful slave trader from Zanzibar, whom he appoints governor of Stanley Falls District. The population is subjected to a tax in kind, which is a form of forced labor. The population has to mainly produce rubber, which is in great demand with the booming of bicycles and the invention of the automobile. The immense territory is shared with private companies. The population is under pressure to produce more and more, and those who don't meet the quotas are massacred or mutilated. In 1908, under international pressure, Leopold II cedes the Congo to the Belgian state, which puts a direct end to these methods. In China, slavery is still legal and is facilitated by the numerous crises that the country is going through. But under Western pressure, the country finally abolishes slavery in 1910. In 1930, in the USSR, the Gulag administration is created to manage the forced labor camps. Political opponents, minorities, and rich peasants are locked up and forced to work in remote and hostile areas to build railroads, canals, or exploit resources such as coal or minerals. Over 10 years, about 7 million men are locked up. During the Second World War, the Nazis built forced labor camps called concentration camps, which are intended to make Jews and political prisoners work, often to death. The Empire of Japan also organizes the forced labor of millions of prisoners, mainly Chinese in Manchukuo or Indonesians on the island of Java. After World War II, the Gulf states abolished slavery one by one, but they keep a law that allows employers to confiscate the passports of migrant workers in order to control them and prevent them from leaving. In 1981, Mauritania becomes the last country in the Sahel to abolish slavery, which is still deeply rooted in the culture. With some ethnic groups enslaved for generations, slavery continues in remote areas of the Sahel. In 1992, Pakistan becomes the last country to abolish slavery, freeing thousands of peasants who were working for powerful landowners. In North Korea, prisoners from the Korean War and political prisoners, men, women, and children are exploited in forced labor camps. In addition, the country exports its slave labor around the world, mainly to labor camps in Russia and China, which brings in a lot of money. In 2017, the country successfully tests an intercontinental ballistic missile directly threatening the United States. In retaliation, the UN imposes new sanctions, including the return of North Korean workers to the country. In October 2018, China acknowledges the existence of re-education camps in Xinjiang, where part of the Muslim Uyghur population is locked up. Some camps are accused of organizing forced labor in factories or in cotton fields. In 2021, according to the latest estimates of the International Labor Organization, there are about 50 million slaves in the world, more than ever before in history.
Whoa.
21.3 million are victims of forced labor, of which 3.3 million are children, while 22 million people, mostly women, are victims of forced marriage, which is considered a form of sexual and domestic slavery. Finally, 6.3 million people, again mainly women, are victims of commercial sexual exploitation. In total, women represent about 70% of the world's slaves.
That's more than half.
That's crazy. So actually slavery is more active than it's ever been in our history.
How do you have 5 million slaves in, was it 2021?
Yeah.
In the world.
They said over 50 million between the mixtures of different forms of slavery. Yeah. You might not be, well, no, you might, I was going to say you might not be chained up on a boat, but no, yes you will. You have people putting people in shipping containers and taking them over there, and, you know, so we know that the world of slavery has started from the origin, and it probably won't end until all human life is over.
Yeah.
Wow. And then we can walk around with our iPhones and our Bentleys and big places and all this going on. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. What can you do? I mean, donate to the causes, give of your money, time, and resources.
Yeah, that's the only thing, because you try to intervene on something, you try to get yourself killed trying to get out there on the front line. Stop it! Boy, that's it.
Do not.
I thought that was very educational. He put that video together nicely, you know, with the music and everything, and the educational standpoint of it. It answered some little pieces of questions that I had, like bringing, you know, blacks back to Liberia. I was like, oh, they did take some people back. I mean, sure, they couldn't take all the people back, but they took a good amount of people back. And I asked about that before. People were like, no one was, no, but actually they did.
Gross.
I know, boy. It's been some burping and locking and popping and smocking and some butt smelling. And
who has been doing that?
I'm just kidding, man. All right, y'all. Like, comment, subscribe. Don't take a nosedive, but comment in the section below.
If you want some more. Yeah.